Welcome to the Freight Project podcast, brought to you by Ceresys, a North American third-party logistics company providing shippers transportation management technology and solutions.
On today's The Freight Project podcast episode, I welcome Miles Varghese, CEO and co-founder of freight forwarding management platform CargoLogik. On the episode, Miles and I will discuss the current state of the freight forwarding industry and how more forwarders are using SaaS-based management platforms to compete and bring efficiencies to their business. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Freight Project podcast. Well, hello, Miles. It's a pleasure to have you on as a guest on the Freight Project podcast, as we do with all of our first-time guests, and I'm sure it's just one of many from you, Miles. Let's let the listeners know a little bit about you and your background and what you're up to now.
Thank you, Adam. Grateful to be here. Thanks for having me. Extremely humbled. Been following you and a long-time admirer of your work. And, with the acquisition of, Ceresys, I hope you continue to succeed and continue doing what you're doing, man. I'm really humbled to be here. So thank you for that. And my name is Miles Varghese, as you mentioned, and I'm currently the business co-founder at CargoLogik, which is a brand new venture that I joined the team in November that we started last year. And what we're building is an independent third-party platform that sits in between the independent small to medium-sized freight forwarder or broker and their customers. And the idea behind it is to allow both parties to kind of better collaborate, to better stay in sync, to stay on top of one another. And for the independent forwarder specifically, it can kind of level out the playing field a bit between them and their larger counterparts, their bigger competitors, your Panopinas, your DHLs, that have the economies of scale that makes it very difficult for them to succeed. And right now, the company is based out of Miami. We're a Miami tech company, and we're backed by Rocker Labs here in Wynwood. So if you or any of the listeners want to come visit Miami, highly suggest visiting the Wynwood area, stop by the office. And we're backed by Rocker Labs and also a freight forwarder in Ecuador, who's also our first customer as well.
Well, yeah, I would love to get out to Miami, so I'll take you up on that for sure and check out the ports and all of that. So it's probably a good strategic place to be as well. But, that's pretty cool that, it can be tough. I went out there and looked at your website and kind of did a brief look at the platform and the screenshots that you have on cargologik.com. And, the logistics technology startup scene right now, especially around freight, is getting crowded. And to not have to go it alone, to have that rocker backing and already, one of those first customers, it says a lot about, the faith that folks have in what is possible. And kind of when I looked at it myself earlier this week, I found it interesting. I've used social media management platform tools for a lot of my career, all the way when Hootsuite was just a tiny company back in 2009, and so it reminds me a lot about that, where you have this platform that allows you to manage your business, kind of get ahead, stay strategic, not get mired down in the weeds. And it also reminds me of more of a fuller suite, not just a social media push platform, but like a HubSpot where you're doing multiple facets of the business, like in my perspective, content marketing, analytics, email marketing, just contact management and communication. That's pretty powerful to not have to, duct tape systems together in order to get my job done, right? So with the freight forwarding industry consolidating seemingly quite a bit, you mentioned the bigger players out there. Are you seeing that these types, and that just makes them more powerful, right? Mm-hmm. So are you seeing that these types of platforms like yours, CargoLogik, and maybe some others, will be how that medium to smaller forwarder can really compete with the giants, perhaps offering even more of an intimate experience with their customers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think, it's a future that is essentially inevitable, right? Because technology is the great equalizer. The idea behind technology is essentially to kind of make, a product or a service, but ultimately, something that's going to make your business and your access to this technology cheaper, better, faster, and generally more accessible by everyone, right? That's really the beauty of technology. And it's really to kind of help us improve, to leverage what we have already. And in the case of the independent small to medium forwarder, the smaller offices, who generally have been doing the same thing with the same sort of legacy technology, like you mentioned, kind of patching things together. These are the independent forwarders who still, have a pretty rough go of it. Today they're the backbone of the supply chain. They're trying to keep up with their loyal customers while winning new ones, but they're sending out, tons of quotes to win, these one-off businesses. They're getting tons of calls. They're walking in their office, opening up their inbox, and they're seeing, hundreds of emails, and these texts are, pretty redundant, like, hey, where's my cargo? So the idea with CargoLogik is to kind of help these smaller players kind of, like I said, level that playing field and the technology gap and I guess, the budgets and everything else tied to that exists between the bigger players and the smaller ones, where the bigger players can build out these innovation teams, can invest in the development and engineering that these smaller players cannot do, right? So ultimately they end up getting more customers. They're able to deliver a better customer experience on top of better rates, right, in the economies of scale, that we're talking about. But really, I think now is an opportunity where new entrants, that are getting into the freight forwarding or the brokerage, space, but even small to medium independent companies who are trying to stay relevant in 2020. I think a solution, like us, like LogicSport, like many other ones that are kind of out there, giving them this all-in-one sort of SaaS tool that is affordable, easy to use, intuitive, accessible on any device for both them as well as their customers. That's really the key to kind of build that more intimate experience that's going to help you retain customers and also, drive more loyalty with those new customers that you're acquiring.
Yeah, I've been in the world of freight, for about a decade now. I came from marketing. I think marketing and finance are obviously more apt to kind of adopt some new technology platforms because to be frank, it was probably disrupted more rapidly after the recession in 2008. And, the classifieds and the newspaper segment, which I used to sell, by the way, suffered pretty greatly. And so it had to reinvent itself. And so in that marketing and advertising realm, digital was really not just disruption, but it was almost a necessity because you had to do less with more. You couldn't invest in, huge advertising platforms. You had to use things like SEO. And so I'm going to challenge you a little bit here. You're a technology startup focused on the freight world, but even the TMS space, Ceres has had a web-based TMS all the way in 1998, right? And that was magical. But even adoption rates of TMS by shippers or even carriers are still not a majority in 2020. And I think that's rapidly changing. But, isn't the real power of freight forwarding, aren't you going to get guys and gals out here that say, hey, look, I have relationships and that's really all I need and I'm fine? Won't they really push back and say, look, I don't need a platform. I'm doing just okay, and kind of keep with the status quo?
Yeah, and you said the magic word right there, Adam. It's relationships, right? This industry is premised on relationships. It's pretty niche if you look at a lot of other industries that are, very large and commoditized. Everyone sort of knows each other. There's not that many folks that are like you that have this 10 years of experience, but also this modern, marketing edge, to say the least. So I think that, right now, adversity, in getting adoption, getting pushback, I think is just the natural order of any industry that's undergoing a rapid innovation. And in my opinion, this is happening right now, in the supply chain space and log tech and maritime shipping, where, if you even look at one of these nice landscapes that these incubators and accelerators are putting out, like Startup Wharf, or the Dock Innovation in Israel, you'll see like a couple of hundred startups there, maybe max, right? Even on CB Insights, you'll see a couple hundred startups in this space. But you look at like sales technology or marketing technology, you're going to see thousands and thousands of startups. What has happened in these other industries are kind of happening right now in parallel, to this specific industry. And that's also why I think it's such a great opportunity for startups that actually know the space, that have some level of expertise, that have these relationships to really succeed, right? And I think that's the differentiator. You do have a lot of startups that are kind of coming up that are, saying, hey, this is a hot space and trying to jump into it. But without that sort of direct experience, being able to, to talk the talk, to have the same relationships and run in the same sort of circles, if you will, is quite difficult, as you might imagine, when you're trying to push, new technology. So, Coupling that with the idea behind CargoLogik, which was specifically the first thing that we're going to have a big impact on is to remove all the redundant communication, right? The time that's being wasted on those texts, hey, where's my cargo? Or trying to dig up compliance documentation in your Google Drive or my Dropbox, right? And the idea would be to free up the valuable overhead and resources for these independent forwarders who are just struggling, right, with these smaller margins to stay alive, to stay relevant. To keep up with the times and technology when they have, a smaller team, a smaller budget, not the best rates. If you're looking at the market in general, you're looking at, digital forwarders that have entered the space as well. So I think, this entire sort of movement towards SaaS, and away from these sort of legacy lifetime license systems is kind of happening now. And there's a famous saying actually that, that kind of, it's pretty standard, I guess, in the modern startup world out of Silicon Valley by a guy named Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz. And, his phrase that everyone sort of repeats is that software is eating the world. And what that means is that there's a massive shift that's happening in these industry verticals from a legacy, hey, buy your server, maintain it, pay for the overhead, absorb the risk associated with that, pay, for a 5, 6, 7 year deal, pay everything up front, to a more, modern SaaS type approach that we see with like Salesforce, right? Or Gmail, or Microsoft 365, right? Where the costs have come down dramatically. How the pace of which they're innovating, listening to customers has shifted. So I think, this is just happening now. And it's going to take a little bit of time, not going to lie, for the supply chain players, to come around, but it will happen. And one thing I did want to quickly add too, as well, prior to this startup, I was working for a company called Octopi, also a Miami tech company here. And Octopi, we were actually the first software as a service port terminal operating system. So the core software running your port terminal, the gate ins, the gate outs, the stacking of cargo, vessel planning, stowage, sequencing, all that fun stuff that's happening at that ground level of the port, where it's essentially a black box. This shift had really kind of happened with Octopi within the last 3 years, away from these really heavy upfront, stiff, applications and high costs associated with that sort of business model, right? So I think, with that, the 3 years of experience that I did have, I was able to build a lot of these relationships. So I think, when you have that relationships, you have those relationships in place, coupled with, a deeper understanding of technology and if you want to call it Silicon Valley SaaS expertise, we can call it that. That's an easy way to kind of understand it. But I think when you remove the redundancy and waste at these organizations, you're not really removing, the relationship, the human to human aspects behind it. Instead, you're actually enhancing those relationships and allowing more time for those relationships to be more fruitful, because you're not wasting that other party's time, right? Your customer's time or your time, going back and forth via text, and trying to stay on top of things. This is an independent platform that kind of optimizes operations on both sides of the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of reminds me of a tweet I saw this morning where this marketer, thought leader I follow on Twitter, she said, companies, please, nobody wants to see a tweet of what booth number you are at an upcoming trade show, right? And it's kind of like going through the motions, right? And I think you look at these platforms and some people may, as I pose the question to you, say, I already have my relationships, I don't need technology. But at the end of the day, what you're getting away from is sharing information that really nobody wants to spend time doing keystrokes or thumb strokes, if you will, around. I sure don't. I can't type on the phone. That's why I do text via the web browser. But, people want to talk about the good stuff and how we can strategically move things forward, and when you talk not about process, but about results and strategy, then that's when you can get to new levels where you collaborate around the outcomes as opposed to the process. And frankly, if anybody says to me, I really love talking about process, that's cool. That's important. But when you get to the execution side, what we don't want to be talking about is broken processes or disjointed communications that then break your processes. So if you are a process-driven person, I have to tell you, you're going to love probably a platform because it's going to automate a lot of those processes and make the focus on communication and moving the needle. And, I think about the freight forwarding industry at large, which admittedly I'm not as intimate with as much as I am, with the similar position in the truck world, the freight broker, moving all the truck type stuff. But the first thing that comes to mind with freight forwarding to me is ocean and air shipping. But, why do these kinds of shipping modes, they have a lot of unique processes and probably thousands of them, compliance, just booking, et cetera. How, without a platform, and maybe this is my ignorance, how are forwarders really doing the best job they can, to gain market share, keep customers happy, all while keeping, cost lows to get to that profitability, as you mentioned? I mean, not only all of that, but there's so many disruptions at ports with things like this coronavirus or trade wars or just an increased activity on the ports with, various consumer confidence in the U.S. I mean, how do they do it without a platform?
Yeah, and that's a great question, right? Similar to you, and being very transparent and honest with you and all the listeners. I'm fairly new when it comes to specifically freight forwarding. And I've been sitting with these user interviews, learning as much as I can, which is kind of the lean startup process. But beyond that, I spent 3 years, in the terminal operating world. So I am, still getting, used to the industry and learning the ins and outs of it. But one thing that is pretty understandable and kind of, I guess, universal is that moving freight isn't easy, right? There's so many moving pieces. So whether you're, your surface transport or your air or sea freight, things get complicated, and they get complicated. And usually when they do, they do it really fast. And usually these complications just kind of waterfall and turn into a bigger impact, down the supply chain, right? Everything is connected. So with those sort of high stakes that exist in, today's world where, the consumer expectations are, Amazon, hey, I want transparency. I want clarity. I want to know when this cargo is going to reach my door. That demand coupled with modern technology has made it quite tough for these smaller players, right? So, these smaller players, the more independent ones, are actually the ones that need, more structure, that need to get away from, doing, these sort of activities like responding, to quotes, right? If the business is only going to stay with you for just that 1 month, is it really worth your time to send out 20 quotes to win, those 3 or 4 one-off businesses, right? It's really hard to survive. And I commend all the independent forwarders that are out there that are alive today in 2020, given with how quickly things are changing. Now you take what's kind of happening in the market, right? And you start adding all these, societal and I guess virus impacts, right? New regulations, new laws, new authorities that are popping up, new compliance, new bureaucracy, whatever it might be. I think it's no longer an option, right? And the companies that are going to be staying alive, through this year, the next, and the following, that can compete with Flexport and digital forwarding, those are the ones that are relentlessly focused on the customer experience, seeking ways to reduce waste, to become more efficient, to strengthen those existing relationships. And they got to do that while keeping that customer involved and aware every step of the way, right? To meet that sort of Amazon effect, 2-day delivery, tell me when my cargo is, 3 stops away, so I think we're kind of seeing all these forces sort of line up. And I genuinely, honestly think that, transparency is no longer an option in business, and having, a platform that gives you that clarity where both sides can see what's happening. They can improve their operations. They can reduce redundancy, all the overhead associated with, these activities that aren't fruitful or going to help them in the longer term. And when you're trying to keep up with 200 emails, 50 texts a day, 24/7, and keep up with those commitments that you have to the customers, that platform is, in my opinion, no longer a nice to have. It's a necessity.
Yeah, hopefully soon table stakes, right? And guys like you at CargoLogik would love that, absolutely, because that's the whole reason you start a business. But altruistically, you hope it helps that small freight forwarder, because they just don't have the luxury of making a mistake or being slow or not getting their information to the customers in a timely manner, because when does that customer say it's time to leave and go to one of your competitors? And frankly, the bigger guys can make those mistakes. They have a lot more room for error. And so it's a dog eat dog world out there. It's tough in and of itself. And so it does seem like freight forwarders really have, especially those medium to small ones, have an incentive to kind of look at these platforms and say, can I do my business better? And, it actually may be more important than ever, actually, for them to sign up at a place like CargoLogik. And, I'll take the commissions of everybody who signs up, Miles. No, I'm joking. But it does sound, you make a very compelling case. I mean, but seriously, right? Who saw the coronavirus coming? I mean, this is really getting people freaked out. I have a Google feed about supply chain and coronavirus, and it is insane how much is going on. I couldn't even keep up with it, and you just got to put your head down and keep focused. And who knows what's going to happen with the China economy. The Chinese economy is maybe projected to do 1%. And in China, that's like the US doing -10% growth. I mean, that's bad, and Germany's already in a recession, and their auto plants are, scared about that coronavirus. And so there's just massive geopolitical issues like Brexit. And man, I'm so glad I'm not a shipper or a freight forwarder. Mm-hmm. So, when you talk to freight forwarders today, are they freaking out? What's going on with them? What are you hearing from people?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and they seem to be pretty unanimous with all the user interviews. And we've spoken with 30 or 40, forwarders and brokers that are kind of in the space and around the space to kind of get their opinions, to get their guidance and feedbacks. Right, going back to that magic word, relationships. Really, that's what it's going to take, right, to succeed as an entrepreneur, as an adventurer. Right, so part of our process, using lean startup principles and methodology, making sure that we're not building anything that the market isn't demanding or asking for us, is something that we have to, be very aware of and cognizant of, right? Wherever we deploy our engineering and design resources and our efforts, we need to make sure that we're going to get an ROI there and be able to kind of build our own business up, right? So part of that, right, our success is premised on that of the customers. And what we're seeing is kind of pretty unanimous, right? So wherever we go, whether it's like, our beta users in Costa Rica, Panama, Ecuador, here in Miami, wherever they are, we're seeing these same nodding heads, when we're asking these questions of, hey, do you have challenges around this? Do you have, process issues tied to, this specific aspect of the relationship? And they're telling us the same sort of things, right? And what those 4 things are that we've been able to kind of easily identify. And I think, the customer experience, right, has been something that has been in existence for a while. The best companies have always been thinking about the customer experience. But until now, you have this merger of technology with that sort of mindset that not too many people actually have. And thus, you need to create something that's going to deliver value on both sides of the relationship. And those things are, right, being able to track and communicate cargo status. If there's issues, if there's exceptions, you need to be able to quickly alert that other party, right, about that, right, beyond just WhatsApp. Right. If you've got 50 shipments going at the same time, right, and you're trying to communicate about one of those shipments, it can get kind of difficult. You might need to get that freight forwarder, right, or that customer to hop on the call to kind of clarify, right, or you're going to have to get more information tied to their quote requests, right? So that tedious quoting and booking process, lots of back and forth that's associated with there. And forget it if you're in a different time zone because people are going to be in meetings, you're trying to be as responsive as you can as a freight forwarder. And, the last thing you want to do is to have someone on the other side of the table waiting for you. Right. And that's the same sort of thing with critical documents where, you're trying to figure out, hey, where's that compliance document? Is it in my Dropbox, like I was saying earlier, or is it in your Google Drive, right? And, or do we need to comb through, 30 email threads, with 50 people, copied to try to find this compliance document that we need because CBP is asking for it right now. Right. So those are kind of like the real 4 big pain points that we've kind of identified that is especially apparent within the independent, smaller to medium size freight forwarder and broker. And that's being able to easily track and communicate cargo status, communicating back and forth about shipments, finding those critical documents when you need them the most, and the tedious quoting and booking process, right? And so that's where we're seeing the most yeses, the most nodding heads, and where we've kind of focused our efforts as a startup to kind of deliver the most value. And over time, as we acquire more beta users and more customers, we're going to be leaning on them and their feedback to understand where in the market we should be heading and what features should we be building, what should we not be building, and not based on just thought or feel, but actual data, right? And that's kind of where our SaaS expertise and design expertise come into play. In our belief, the optimal customer experience is one that's premised around modern SaaS, design thinking, usability, proper user experience and interfaces, and making sure that the platform or whatever it is that you're using is optimized and taking into consideration not just your time as a forwarder or broker, but that of your customer as well. And I think this is kind of prime grounds right now and almost land grab for the supply chain if you're a technology company with the right expertise.
Yeah, no doubt. And, I'm sorry for the listeners that I described a dystopian future for all of freight and the world in my explanation of what's going wrong around us. But hey, that's life, man. Stuff happens. And when the
Mhm.
crap hits the fan, as they say, it's all about how you react. And if CBB's coming around and they would need a document, you better give it to them. That's just life. And so if you can't get it, information access, or you can't communicate the reasons why to your customer, whatever it is, then
Mhm.
it's going to be a tough day for you. And, right now in the startup phase of CargoLogik, you're talking to a ton of people. You really seem to focus on relationships. And I really
Mhm.
love that, and so you're probably undoubtedly also getting ideas from other freight technology startup guys and gals and,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So what are the common themes that you're kind of seeing around the freight technology space today? Are you getting a sense of what forwarders, shippers, and carriers really need? Because, in this industry, we tend to sometimes go blockchain, machine learning, bliggity, magic wizards, drones, and all
Yeah.
that. And that's
Yeah.
cool. But is that really helping us today? I don't know. So what are you hearing from those folks?
Yeah, so I think there's a triangulation, right? For us as a startup.
Woo, triangulation. I love
Isn't that a great word?
That's a
Like
good
we
word.
need to make sure that we're on the right path and that we're building something that the market wants, right? And again, going back to the last question, that's actually what separates the startups that are successful and those that are not. Like, are you actually listening to the market and hearing what they're saying? So I think one of the things that that's pretty common that we're hearing at every JOC conference, Lat Imports, whatever conference it is that you're going to, right? The first thing is visibility, right? And that's supply chain visibility. It's the holy grail. Everyone is kind of searching for it. They're trying to get it. They're trying to get more accurate delivery times. They're trying to relay that to the customer in the most timely way possible. And they're essentially, kind of competing with one another as well, right? Where they understand now at this point in time, it's a matter of innovation, and making sure that you're keeping up with the times. Now if you're looking at the independent freight forwarder and brokerage market, especially here in Miami or in LA, where it's very fractured, or in LATAM, for the most part, a lot of the players in the industry are still running on pen and paper. They're looking at Excel spreadsheets, or maybe they purchased some legacy software that they're hosting maybe 10 years ago that isn't meeting all their needs, or they patched up all these different sort of solutions, thinking that they got the best thing underneath the sun. But what they'll quickly find is, as time goes on, as technology advances, and these legacy technologies that you made these heavier investments in, they will start breaking apart. They won't be easy to connect, right? So I think people are trying to kind of take all this data, understand what to do with it, and then making sure that whatever niche that you're in the shipping world, that you kind of emphasize, hey, I'm not only in this niche, but I have, and we have this relationship, but I'm going to make sure that you've got the best digital customer experience possible, right? So making sure that the organization, regardless of what it is in the supply chain, is armed with the best tools, focusing on that customer experience, finding ways to leverage the existing resources, reducing waste within the workplace, and not at just the customer level or the commercial level, but every step of the way, operations, warehousing, you name it, making sure that we're increasing the effectiveness of what it is that they're already doing is the key to building a sustainable, and thriving business in 2020, right? And again, it's just all about it's all about those relationships at the end of the day.
Yeah, I love that, man. And you're speaking the language of the forwarder, right? When the ones that say, I'm good, my relationships are good, and they have objections, like they're going to hear that from you. And that comes clear through everything you're saying. So, before I let you go, I want to make sure people understand where they can learn more if you're a freight forwarder or just interested in what CargoLogik's doing. I hear, on your website, I saw something about a private beta this month where maybe a few forwarders can kind of kick the tires on the platform. So how can a forwarder find out more information about that?
And appreciate that, Adam. Thanks for the shout out, and I will make sure to cut you out that nice commission check later on, buddy. But yeah, we're opening up the private beta starting next week, and really getting these first early adopters onto the system, and we're not jumping directly into the market, and that's why we're calling this a private beta, because we're not just kind of opening the floodgates and letting everyone in. The idea is to kind of work with these independent forwarders specifically that have these sort of pain points that we've identified, and making sure that we're providing them, that specific segment of the market, the best sort of solution that they can have, and innovating with them. right now, right? So right now we're trying to find, specifically, these independent small to medium forwarders who are forward thinking, who are not afraid of technology, who embrace it, who understand that, everything is about the customer experience. And usually, they may have multiple offices, but they're generally small. So we're looking, even startup, brokers and forwarders, we'd be interested in talking to, but usually around, maybe 10 to 50, 60, 70 people is sort of our sweet spot and kind of what we're optimizing our platform for. So if you know anyone, man, or any of the listeners, if this is you, definitely feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, Miles Varghese, or our web, or my email address, miles@cargologic.com, which I think you're going to post. And then, obviously our website has that nice video on there too, so people can get more information and fill out a contact us form if they want to do that too.
Yeah,
thank you.
Right on. Yeah, definitely on the publish page. I'll make sure I put all that information once this comes out. And Miles, thanks again for your time today. Best of luck with the startup, man. It's a hard life out there, and those willing to go after it are going to get it. And when you remember people are part of that, relationships matter. I agree with you. I think CargoLogik is going to be just fine with that focus in the freight forwarding world. So thank you so much for coming on. And for all of our listeners out there of the Freight Project podcast, thank you for tuning in each week, and we'll see you on the next one.